February 25th, 1969. A Tuesday morning across New England. The kind of late winter day that feels borrowed from an earlier month. In Portland, Maine, snow from the week before still lines the curbs in gray, packed ridges. Smoke rises thin and straight from brick chimneys along Congress Street. The air smells of salt and diesel, the harbor quiet except for the creak of fishing boats rocking against ice-crusted pilings. A few men stand on the docks, hands deep in canvas jacket pockets, watching the water. In Vermont's hill towns, children walk to school through slush that soaks through leather boots. The roads are a mix of gravel, mud, and compressed snow. Farmers are already hours into their day, feeding livestock in barns that smell of hay and manure and cold wood, the floors slick with frozen mud. In Boston, streetcars clatter along rails slick with ice melt. Morning commuters board in wool coats and galoshes. The Charles River is partially frozen. Steam rises from grates in the pavement. Newspapers report light snow expected later in the day. By mid-morning, the sky begins to change. It doesn't darken all at once. It thickens. The pale winter light that had filtered through the clouds begins to fade, replaced by something heavier. The air feels compressed, damp and cold in a way that settles into your chest. In fishing villages along the Massachusetts coast, old men glance at the sky with the kind of attention that comes from decades of reading weather. The gulls have gone quiet. The wind, which had been light and offshore, shifts. It starts coming in from the northeast, steady, insistent smelling of deep water. By noon, the barometric pressure is dropping faster than forecasters expected. In small weather stations scattered across New Hampshire and Maine, observers note the readings with growing unease. The numbers don't match the predictions. Something is forming offshore, and it's moving faster than anyone thought it would. By early afternoon, the first flakes begin to fall. They come down light at first, dry, small, the kind of snow that dusts car hoods and melts on warm pavement, but within an hour the flakes grow larger, wetter, falling in thicker curtains. The wind picks up, the temperature drops, and the storm that would bury New England for days begins in earnest. What hit New England on February 25th wasn't a single storm. It was two. One system had been building over the Great Lakes, cold, dry, pulled down from the Arctic by a deep trough in the jet stream. The other was moving up the Atlantic coast, drawing warm, moisture-laden air from the Gulf Stream. Separately, each system would have brought snow. Together, they created something far more destructive. They met off the coast of Cape Cod. When warm air collides with cold air over water, the moisture condenses rapidly. The storm intensifies. Winds spiral inward. Snow falls not in flurries but in walls. Meteorologists call it bombogenesis, a rapid drop in pressure that turns a storm into a blizzard in hours. New England sits in what some forecasters quietly refer to as a snow bomb corridor. The geography funnels storms. The coastline bends, the mountains channel winds and cold air pools in valleys with nowhere to go. When conditions align, the region becomes a trap. On February 25th, the conditions aligned. What surprised many, even those who had lived through harsh winters, was how quickly the storm overwhelmed the infrastructure. In 1969, many New England towns still relied on aging equipment. Plows were often repurposed trucks, some dating back to the 1940s, fitted with blades and operated by volunteer crews. Roads in rural areas weren't paved. Communication lines ran on wooden poles strung through forests and along exposed ridges. When snow began piling up faster than plows could move it, the system strained. And the early forecasts had been wrong. The National Weather Service had predicted light to moderate snow, 6 to 10 inches at most. Newspapers that morning mentioned the possibility of accumulation, but nothing that suggested alarm. Schools stayed open. Businesses operated as usual. People went to work. By mid-afternoon, It was clear the forecasts had underestimated everything. The snow was falling at rates of 2 to 3 inches per hour. Winds were gusting above 50 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to near zero. Roads that had been passable at noon were impassable by 3. Drifts began forming in minutes, not hours, sculpted by winds that moved snow like water, carving it into waves that climbed fences, buried cars, blocked doorways. By evening, the storm had intensified into a full whiteout. And New England, unprepared, began to disappear beneath it. On the summit of Mount Washington, 6,288 feet above sea level, weather observer Robert Monahan prepared for what he knew would be a long night. Mount Washington is one of the most extreme weather stations in the United States. Winds there have been recorded at over 200 miles per hour. Winter conditions on the summit are closer to the Arctic than to the valleys below. Observers live in a small stone building anchored to the peak with chains, supplies brought up by snow tractor or carried on foot. Monahan had been stationed there for 2 years. He was used to storms. But the evening of February 25th was different. The storm hit the summit before it reached the towns below. By late afternoon, winds were already gusting past 80 miles per hour. Snow wasn't falling. It was moving horizontally, driven by wind so strong it rattled the walls of the observatory. The windows, thick and reinforced, vibrated in their frames. Monahan later described the sound as constant, a low roar beneath the sharper screams of wind hitting the building's edges. The snow didn't accumulate. It compacted instantly, pressed into ice by the force of the wind. Within hours, the observatory was encased. Drifts built against the walls, climbing higher as the night wore on. Inside, the air was cold despite the heaters. Frost formed on the interior walls. The barometric pressure continued to drop. Monahan recorded wind speeds every hour, 90 miles per hour, then 100, then higher. The anemometer, the instrument that measures wind speed, stopped working around midnight. Ice had seized the mechanism. He had no way to know the exact speed after that. He could only estimate by sound, by the force shaking the building, by the way objects inside the room shifted slightly with each gust. He couldn't see anything outside. The windows were sheets of white, snow and ice pressed so thick against the glass that no light penetrated. The world beyond the walls had disappeared. In his log he wrote simply, "Conditions extreme. Visibility 0, wind unrelenting." Below, in the valleys and towns scattered across New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, and Massachusetts, the storm buried everything in silence. People trapped in their homes described the same sensation, the absence of normal sound. No cars, no voices, no distant hum of machinery. Just wind and the hiss of snow against windows and the occasional crack of a tree branch breaking under weight. In small farmhouses, families gathered near wood stoves, feeding them through the night to keep pipes from freezing. Livestock huddled in barns. Some barns, older structures with roofs weakened by previous winters, began to groan under the accumulating load. In one town in Vermont, a farmer named Harold Patch heard his barn roof give way just after midnight. He later told reporters the sound was like a slow sigh, timbers bending, then snapping, the whole structure collapsing inward in seconds. His cattle, penned inside, were buried. He couldn't reach them until the next afternoon. By then, most had suffocated beneath the snow and wreckage. Monahan, isolated on the summit, had no contact with the outside world. The radio lines were down. The phone lines were buried. He and the other observers waited in the stone building, recording data by lantern light, listening to the storm tear at the mountain. Dawn, when it came, brought no relief. The wind continued. The snow continued. The world remained white and featureless. And across New England, the infrastructure that held towns together began to fail. By the morning of February 26th, New England was no longer a connected region. Utility poles, wooden, weathered, strung with power and telephone lines, began snapping under the weight of ice and snow. The lines themselves, coated in frozen rime, grew heavier with each passing hour. When the wind hit them, they swayed. When they swayed too far, the poles cracked at the base and fell, taking entire sections of communication and power with them. In Maine, entire towns lost electricity before dawn. In New Hampshire, rural homes went dark one by one as transformers blew and lines went down. In Massachusetts, neighborhoods that had power at midnight were without it by morning. Repair crews tried to respond. They couldn't. Roads were impassable. Plows, already working through the night, were buried themselves or had broken down. Snowdrifts weren't just deep. They were sculptural, carved by wind into shapes that blocked entire streets. In some towns, drifts climbed to second-story windows. Cars disappeared completely, identifiable only as mounds along the roadside. Highways became parking lots of abandoned vehicles. Drivers, caught between towns when visibility dropped to nothing, pulled over and waited. Some waited hours. Some waited through the night. When morning came, many were buried so deep they couldn't open their doors. In Boston, the transit system ground to a halt. Streetcars froze to their tracks. Buses couldn't move. The subway system, mostly above ground in outlying areas, was blocked by drifts. Commuters who had gone to work the day before couldn't get home. Hundreds slept in offices, train stations, hotel lobbies, anywhere with heat. Rail corridors across the region were buried. Freight trains stopped. Passenger trains stopped. The supply chains that moved food, fuel, and medicine into cities broke. Coastal towns were cut off entirely. Roads leading in and out were impassable. Harbors were frozen. Fishing boats were locked in ice. Towns that relied on deliveries from larger cities, bread, milk, coal for heating, found themselves isolated with whatever supplies they had on hand. Plows worked in shifts, drivers exhausted, pushing snow that had nowhere to go. In narrow streets, they piled it against storefronts, against homes, wherever there was space. In wider areas, they created walls, packed ridges of snow 10, 12 feet high, turning streets into tunnels. Roofs continued to collapse. Barns, garages, older homes with flat or gently sloped roofs. The snow wasn't light and powdery. It was wet, dense, heavy. A cubic foot of it weighed 15 to 20 pounds. On a roof, that weight multiplied across hundreds of square feet. Beams bent. Rafters cracked. Some collapses were sudden, timber snapping, the whole structure caving inward in seconds. Others were slow, roofs sagging visibly, families evacuating just before the final failure. In Vermont, an entire dairy barn collapsed with 40 cows inside. The farmer and his neighbors spent hours digging through wreckage with shovels, pulling animals out one by one. Most didn't survive. Mechanics failed in predictable ways. Hydraulics froze, engines seized, metal became brittle in the extreme cold. Equipment that had worked for decades stopped working. Plows jammed, chains broke, fuel lines clogged with ice. People adapted with what they had. In some towns, residents dug tunnels through drifts to reach neighbors. In others, they used sleds pulled by hand to move supplies. Those with snowshoes became messengers, carrying information between isolated homes and the nearest road. But for many, there was nothing to do but wait. Wait for the wind to stop, wait for the snow to end, wait for someone to dig them out. By the second night, the storm was still falling. The storm lasted 4 days. When it finally moved offshore on March 1st, it left behind a region transformed. Snow totals varied, 18 inches in some areas, over 30 in others. But the accumulation alone didn't capture the damage. It was the wind, the drifts, the cold, the duration. It was the way the storm had dismantled the infrastructure quietly, piece by piece, until towns were islands and families were alone. The human cost became clear slowly, as roads were cleared and rescues began. Emergency crews, working around the clock, found people trapped in cars buried under 10 feet of snow. Some had survived by running their engines intermittently, keeping warm until the fuel ran out. Others had tried to walk and collapsed in drifts, disoriented by whiteout conditions, freezing within yards of shelter they couldn't see. In rural areas, elderly residents living alone were found days later, their homes dark and cold, no way to call for help. Some had died from hypothermia, others from heart attacks brought on by shoveling snow in extreme conditions. The final toll was over 70 dead across New England. Thousands had been trapped. Hundreds of buildings, barns, garages, sheds, homes were destroyed or damaged. Livestock losses numbered in the thousands. Roads took weeks to fully clear. Power wasn't restored to some areas until mid-March. But the immediate aftermath was quieter than the storm itself. Dawn on March 2nd broke cold and still. The wind had stopped. The sky, for the first time in days, was clear. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, vertical lines, a sign that people inside had survived, that fires were burning, that life continued. The landscape was unrecognizable. Streets were canyons carved between walls of snow. Cars were buried shapes beneath white mounds. Trees, bent under the weight of ice, formed arches over roads. Entire towns looked different, smaller, compressed, as if the storm had pressed them into the earth. People emerged slowly. They stepped outside into silence. No cars, no machinery yet, just the crunch of boots on frozen snow and the distant sound of shovels scraping. In Boston, crews worked to dig out the transit system. In Maine, power line workers climbed poles in sub-zero temperatures, replacing miles of downed wire. In Vermont, farmers cleared barns and counted losses. Across the region, neighbors helped neighbors, digging out driveways, sharing food, checking on the elderly. There were no speeches, no grand declarations, just the quiet, methodical work of recovery. New England had endured worse winters. It would endure worse again. But the blizzard of 1969 remained, for those who lived through it, a marker, a storm that arrived quietly, buried everything, and left the region reshaped. Towns rebuilt, roads were cleared. Spring came eventually, melting the drifts, revealing the damage beneath. But the memory stayed. The way the sky had darkened that Tuesday afternoon, the sound of wind that didn't stop, the silence when it finally did. New England, a region defined by its winters, remembered this one. And endured.